market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Tom McKenzie in London, stepping in for Francine. Crossing the terminal right now, some headlines around the bonus pool being put together by Wall Street. Wall Street's bonus pool surging to a record $47.5 billion for 2024. The average annual bonus rising by almost a third to $244,000 US, $244,700 US to be precise. And according to estimates by the New York State Comptroller, these are the details in terms of the lines coming through. Again, the headline, Wall Street bonus pool surging to a record $47.5 billion for 2024, and the average annual bonus up by almost a third. So good news for those on Wall Street. And we'll see, of course, that trend continues through 2025. The deal making will be crucial to that, of course, as well. Now, investors are searching for a clear direction amid weaker US consumer confidence and uncertainty about President Trump's upcoming tariffs. More on this. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel. So, Valerie, if we put the bonus story to one side and focus again on the Trump tariff story, the volatility, the rhetoric, again, almost on a daily basis from this Trump administration, where do things stand right now in terms of how the markets are understanding what is going to happen on April the 2nd?
Well, look, Tom, the market is looking through a lot of uncertainty when it comes to this tariff back and forth. Are there going to be exemptions? Are there not? Or is it going to be targeted? Is it not? A lot of questions still out there. But the equity market in the U.S. with the S&P 500 has now notched 3 straight days of gains, up some 2%. Not a whopping number, Tom, but it should be noted. We've not notched 3 back-to-back days of gains in nearly 2 months. So nice to hit that hurdle. Seems like the equity market, though, is on a more solid footing as we head into that April 2nd deadline. One market, though, that is not on a solid footing, that has been rattled by recent comments from the Trump administration, is the copper market. I know you mentioned previously that COMEX copper hit some record highs in the Asia session overnight. We're seeing quite a divergence between COMEX copper, that's copper traded in New York, versus LME copper. This is something we don't see often, and it's because they're front-loading shipments of copper into the U.S., all these supplies going into U.S. ports, leaving some areas of the globe perilously short on copper supplies. So the copper market continuing to be rattled by threats from the Trump administration that these tariffs could come in a matter of weeks instead of a matter of months. Lastly, Tom, I want to end on the consumer confidence data yesterday. I thought this was important. Again, it came below expectations, below estimates. A shocking read on the expectations component of consumer confidence. This is the 6-month forward-looking component. Came at a 12-year low, but the equity market still not rattled by this. It seems to me that the market is looking for confirmation of the dismal consumer confidence to hit consumer spending. We might have hints of that in the PCE data on Friday.
Yeah, the forward look in terms of expectations from the US consumer out 6 months, pretty dramatic in terms of the drop-off. Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel, thank you very much indeed for the market check on tariffs and the consumer sentiment that continues, of course, to come under pressure stateside. Now to the geopolitics, where the US says Russia and Ukraine have agreed to a ceasefire in the Black Sea. The Kremlin, though, confirming the truce but saying it is conditional on lifting sanctions. Joining me now with the details is Ros Matheson, Bloomberg's EMEA News Director. Ros, how much does this truce actually change things? To what extent has the needle now moved potentially to a more lasting ceasefire?
Well, really, in a way, what this is about reinstalling the Black Sea grain deal that was in place for a while. But even when that deal was scuppered by Russia, Ukraine has continued to send ships through the Black Sea with grain. So tangibly, it doesn't change a whole lot on the ground, or rather on the water in the Black Sea for now. It's basically a version of that deal, perhaps a bit broader in scope. But as you say, Russia is putting a lot of conditions on here and really suggesting that for this to take proper effect, that it wants to see even more action on the sanctions front. I mean, the statement last night from the US talked about giving Russia relief in terms of bringing it back into being able to ship fertilizer more fulsomely, access to agriculture, possibly to payment systems, to easing the cost of insurance for Russian shipping. So there seem to be quite a few goodies in the bag there for Russia already out of this. And the question is this Russia just slowly walking towards some sort of broader ceasefire? And does that at some point become frustrating for Donald Trump? We saw him even raise that question last night. Does he think that Russia is going slow? He said possibly they are, although he believes that they do seriously want a full ceasefire in the end as well.
Yeah, President Trump suggesting that his Russian counterpart is maybe dragging his heels on this deal. But nonetheless, as you say, the Trump administration touting this at least as a modest win. On the flip side, when it comes to the security challenges stateside, the remarkable story and the continued fallout around the Signal group chat and the involvement of a journalist in that chat. What has the fallout been, Roz? Is it likely to put a permanent dent in this Trump administration?
Well, certainly you can see that all the parties involved are coming out strongly to say that they don't feel anything inappropriate happened here, and that saying that they don't think any classified operational information was shared in that Signal chat. That runs counter, of course, to what the Atlantic editor-in-chief, who was in the chat, says that he saw, which was highly classified operational material around this planned strike on the Houthis in Yemen. You can see, obviously, this is causing a bit of a political storm in Washington. They all had to come out yesterday to say, kind of, yes, this happened, but downplaying it as a big deal. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz is saying he regrets that it happened, but again, not saying that there's been any wrongdoing here. So Democrats will push hard on this. You can imagine it's difficult to see what traction they'll get out of it. There is a lawsuit already, but that's more about just barring these officials from using Signal in the future to discuss such high-level classified information or plans around things such as attacking the Houthis again. So it's about limiting the use of Signal versus punitive action against these officials. And Donald Trump for now is standing very much fully behind all of them, including Mike Waltz, including his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, who was allegedly the one who shared the confidential data in that chat. So it's causing a political firestorm. Obviously, it's again, an eye-opener for allies, including in Europe, but it's unlikely to necessarily mean much in the end in terms of the Trump administration.
OK, Bloomberg's Roz Matheson with that important framing. Thank you for the latest. To the UK now, where inflation unexpectedly cooled, strengthening the case for the Bank of England to cut interest rates again in May. We've seen the markets pulling forward those bets in the last hour or so on the back of that data. The data also providing a morale boost for Chancellor Rachel Reeves. And my goodness, did she need one ahead of her spring statement today. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden is at Westminster for us. What does the inflation data mean then for the Chancellor? Does it change anything around the spring statement, Lizzie?
I don't think it does, Tom. It may give her a bit of a spring in her step, and as you say, she really needs one, because the fact is we've got sluggish growth in the UK economy. We've had a rise in long-term gilt yields and therefore government borrowing costs since the start of the year, and it looks like that's going to mean that Rachel Reeves' headroom that she left herself back in October, £9.9 billion, has been wiped out. And in fact, our economists at Bloomberg Economics expect she's going to need to find £17 billion today. Now, she's already said that there'll be £5 billion of welfare cuts. We know that. We know that there's going to be cuts to aid to fund defence. Actually, that's a bit of accounting wizardry because it counts as investment, so that gives her £2.4 billion. But it still leaves her having to find £10 billion, and we're expecting that to come from day-to-day departmental spending budgets. We'll know the total, but we'll find out in June in the spending review where exactly the pinch will come. Now, none of this is easy for a Labour Chancellor to deliver politically. Welfare cuts, aid cuts, cuts to the pensioner winter fuel allowance. It's causing disquiet among not just her party but her cabinet too. But the even bigger problem, perhaps, is that where Rachel Reeves is blaming the global uncertainty for this mess, there likely could be even more of it to come. Remember, her payroll tax rise announced in October comes into effect just days after Donald Trump's Liberation Day, when there are all of these tariffs around the world and the retaliation that we expect to follow. And so it could be that whatever headroom she leaves herself today is wiped out by the autumn, and there's even more pain to come, potentially from tax cuts later in the year.
OK, Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden, thank you. I was about to say tax cuts might be broadly welcomed by many of our viewers if that was the prospect, but it seems pretty unlikely, doesn't it? But tax increases is the threat, isn't it? Possibly in the pipeline for this Chancellor further down the road. Lizzie Burden on the ground for us, Abingdon Green, outside, of course, the Houses of Parliament ahead of the spring statement, and we'll bring you all the details and continue our coverage of that important speech later today. Let's get the analysis right now and bring in Katharine Neiss, Chief European economist at PGIM Fixed Income. Katharine, thank you for waiting patiently in the wings for us here in the studio. Let's start with inflation data then. Is this the start? Do you see a picture of inflation in the UK that is looking more benign, or is this as good as it gets? Do things start to change negatively on the inflation front towards the back end of the year, or are we looking now at a trajectory more closely heading towards that 2% target?
I think it's probably too soon to say. I think we can be pretty confident that inflation is going to go up from here over the course of this year. But of course, today's print is very good news. It's great news for the Chancellor this week, as your presenter just pointed out. And of course, it comes sort of hot on the heels of better news also on the flash PMIs, which are probably, one of the best indicators we have of what is happening, right now in terms of the real economy. So there again, we had a bit more of a positive, outturn, especially in domestic services sector. So that puts things in a better starting point, I think, just for today in terms of the messaging. But as Lizzie pointed out, it's not going to solve the problems of the world. And I think that those screws will be turning tighter as we progress through the years, including on inflation.
Where does that leave your projection around growth for the UK then?
So I think the big wild card here is what is going to happen with tariffs. And so that makes making a projection for tariffs very, very difficult. And the key point to stress here is it's not so much tariffs that are being levied on the UK, but really on the euro area, because the euro area is still our largest and most important trading partner. And that is a big unknown about how severe these trade tensions between the US and Europe are going to be. And I think there's a real risk that we could kind of go to hell and back in some ways on tariffs, where, the threats could ratchet up. We may end up in a place that doesn't look too bad, but all of that uncertainty and the prospect that we could land in a very negative place, I think, is going to be quite dampening. And again, you see that in the PMI data. The manufacturing for the UK continues to be very weak.
Are the markets right then, given the softer inflation print of today and those challenges coming through from the Trump tariff regime, to pull forward? Are the markets right to pull forward their bets on rate cuts for the BOE?
So, the Bank of England is the UK policy mix is stuck in a chicken and egg situation. We need rates to come down in order to take the fiscal pressure off, but you can't take the fiscal pressure off with, without having a credible plan, because that could drive rates higher. So there is a sequencing problem here. And I think what we need to see first is the Labour government in the autumn statement, what we're expecting today, it's going in the right direction, but it feels a little bit incremental. We need to see more. I think markets aren't quite convinced in terms of fiscal responsibility, and that signal is needed in order for the Bank of England to come down. I think we can be confident that interest rates are coming down in the UK, but, this is a very narrow path that the Bank of England and the fiscal authority needs to tread in order to, get that sequencing right. And there's a risk if they don't that we won't see those cuts come down.
OK, so the markets and traders within gilts as well are still kind of watching with eagle eyes in terms of what comes through on this. I mean, we're seeing yields down across the curve today, but you're suggesting that could be short-lived because market sentiment could change again. Absolutely.
I don't think that this vulnerability, I don't think treading this narrow path is going to be clarified by what we hear from the Chancellor today, because I think that, a lot of what is going to be announced, the market's already baked in. It's essentially just restoring the wafer-thin headroom that she already had. It's not really going to go far enough in terms of really demonstrating, I think, clearly that these tough decisions are being made in terms of, cutting back on spending in a way and being fiscally prudent in a way that the market really takes as a strong signal and then gives space for the Bank of England to start cutting. It's just a very difficult, narrow path. And it hinges also a lot on what is happening on rates elsewhere. If rates are higher in Europe, in the US, what's the benefit to buying UK gilts? So, there's that relative value point as well.
Just very briefly,
pressure.
before we let you go, on that international picture, how much is priced into bunds at this point on the defence spend out of Germany?
I think too much. I think, it is a game changer what we're seeing in Germany, but it's going to take time for this stuff to hit the ground. This stuff is not shovel ready, either on defense or infrastructure. It needs to be complemented to be really impactful by reforms. We don't know yet what that's going to look like. We don't even have a German government yet. And maybe they burned a lot of political capital to jam this money through.
Yeah.
So I think it's maybe going to underwhelm a little bit relative to that initial impact.
All right, very interesting. Katharine, Neiss, thank you very much on the UK and, of course, a line as well on the German defence spend and maybe some questions that need to be answered before we get more confidence in how that story evolves. Katharine Neiss, Chief European Economist at PGIM Fixed Income. Coming up, more on the spring statement. I'm going to be joined by John Caudwell, British entrepreneur, of course, and founder of Phones for You. His views coming up. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. We are just a few hours, of course, from the UK spring statement, a crucial test for the Labour government. My next guest was a long-term Tory donor and last summer switched alliances and voted for Labour. Ahead of the spring statement then, John Caudwell, British entrepreneur and founder of Phones for You, joins me. John, thank you for taking the time. Of course, a prominent voice within the British entrepreneurial scene. John, how are you feeling right now about this UK economy?
Overall, I would say very disappointed because I think Labour are doing a lot of things that are arguably very wrong. They are doing a lot of things that are right as well. So, you know, there's some good stuff coming down the pipeline that will make a difference. But for me, everything feels like too little, too late. There isn't that dynamicism that I would expect out of leaders. I mean, we never get that with politicians. We know that. We very rarely get real action, and action that is the correct action done in a proper way. But, you know, it really feels as though Labour are slow off the mark, and this is crucial for the UK economy.
Slow off the mark. What kind of score would you get? How would you grade this Labour government then at this point, John? I mean, you talked about the need for GDP growth, for a focus on the environment. The outlook for growth is expected to be cut later today. Inflation has made a bit of progress, but we face potential tariff threats. There is still concern about how much fiscal firepower this government has. How would you grade this Labour government at this point?
Well, that's an interesting question, Tom, because first of all, I have to say there's two answers to that. One's an absolute answer and one's a relative answer. Relative to how I consider that the other parties would have performed, I think they're doing okay. In absolute terms, I would expect them to do a lot more and a lot quicker and be smarter. I think some of their measures and actions that they've taken, especially in the budget, were wrong. There's so much more that they can do to attract inward investment. I think they're relying on certain actions that they've taken to improve the economy over the next 3 or 4 years. But the actions that they've taken, I don't personally think will have a significantly positive effect to really match up with anywhere near my expectations.
So, John, what is the policy prescription then? What would you put at the top of your list that this government should reach for, should target to reinvigorate the growth of the UK economy?
Gosh, that's a whole day's discussion, but let's just pin it down to 2 or 3 things. Firstly, really cutting the state sector cost. We've got 1.2 trillion of state spending. If I couldn't cut 3 or 4% off that, which would be 30 to 40 billion pounds a year, if I couldn't do that quickly and effectively without damaging the country's economy, then I would sack myself without any shadow of a doubt. That's the first thing. The second thing alongside that, which is a bit slower, but attract inward investment. Now, Labour say they're doing that by deregulating planning and by deregulating in general, and absolutely that is an important factor in any country's economy and attracting inward investment. But they need to do so much more, and it's no good relying on deregulation to do the job. We need an attractive package to go to businesses all around the world. And I have literally been preaching for now 5 years, first of all to the Tories, that we need to attract the very highest technological companies into Britain, and especially those to do with the environment, because without doubt, environmental technologies, intellectual and product, will be a massive export item in the future. And if we became the Silicon Valley of the environment and technology, Britain's future would be absolutely assured.
John, it's interesting. It sounds like in terms of cutting costs, you think we should have kind of a DOGE, a Department of Government Efficiency here in the UK. But I know you're also kind of touting the idea that we could benefit from a kind of brain drain as well out of the US. Do we need our own DOGE?
Well, yeah, but not DOGE as it's being done by Elon Musk. Absolutely not. No, it needs to be done selectively, intelligently, and slower than that. You can't do it like it's happening in the States without really damaging the infrastructure. You have to make intelligent decisions on every single person, and that would take probably realistically a couple of months if you're assessing, say, 600,000 civil servants. And by the end of a couple of months, you'd have people in red, amber, green. The reds, what you would know you need to get rid of. The ambers you need to make better or make more efficient, and the greens are all go. And that would take at least a couple of years. You can't just go in and sack people willy-nilly. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong.
John, was scrapping the non-Don status the right move?
No, totally wrong. Totally wrong. You know, it was wrong on two issues. It was wrong financially for the country, and it was wrong from a fairness point of view. And let me put the fairness point of view first of all. If people came to the UK 2 or 3 years ago for non-dom status, and most of the worldwide earnings that have been achieved whilst in other places, whether it was Dubai, Monaco, wherever it was, if their earnings had been achieved somewhere else, why should they have to pay tax on their entire earnings suddenly 2 years later, having lived in the UK? That's not fair. It's not fair. It's not right. But equally, it's driving them back into places like Milan and Monaco and Dubai. And we cannot afford those moneymakers.
Are you seeing some of those moneymakers snapping up your flats in Mayfair, John? How's that going? It's been a tough environment for the high end when it comes to the London property market. Are you seeing decent sales?
We're definitely
okay, and what's the pricing like?
We're definitely seeing a big interest in American interest. There's a lot of Americans coming over now and looking for apartments and talking about citizenship in the UK. So that's positive. On the negative side, we're definitely losing very wealthy people into Monaco, Milan and Dubai, and that's really disturbing.
OK, John, really appreciate your time, as ever. John Caudwell, British entrepreneur, of course, founder of the former mobile phones retailer Phones for You. We appreciate your time. Coming up, an exclusive conversation with the CFO of BAE Systems, as defence stocks, of course, benefit from Europe's military spending boost. That conversation is next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. Welcome to The Pulse. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are your top stories. The US announces a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine in the Black Sea. Moscow, though, says key sanctions need to be lifted first. US copper futures surge to a record on a Bloomberg report that President Trump could slap import duties on the metal much earlier than expected. And UK inflation unexpectedly cools in a boost for Chancellor Rachel Reeves ahead of her spring statement this afternoon. Now to the defence space. Mario Draghi saying that Germany's decision to ramp up defence spending is, quote, a game changer. But the former ECB president warns there are risks when it comes to how it's implemented. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Oliver Crook for the latest then. Ollie, you focused very squarely on the Draghi report when that came through. That was a key part of your reporting. How does what we hear from Draghi today change the view on the defence spend of Europe?
Well, what I think is really interesting, Tom, is when you think about when the Draghi report was originally published, which was back in September of last year, right? This was a completely different world for Europe in September of last year than what it is today. This is even before Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. And there are many ways in which, Tom, Donald Trump is actually Mario Draghi's sort of greatest ally in sort of putting the pressure and the urgency on the Europeans for what basically Draghi was basically forecasting for the European economy. He was basically saying that the European economy was doomed to obsolescence. lessons. That was in large part basically due to some of the actions from the United States, even under the Biden administration, Inflation Reduction Act, and basically how uncompetitive the European economy was versus the United States, but also China, right? And now we live in a completely different world where the defense paradigm has been blown to pieces. We talk about basically now industrial policy in the United States potentially being even more threatening to Europe than the Chinese policy is. And this is basically what has got policymakers in Europe to actually wake up. And part of the evidence of that is what we're seeing in Germany. I think what his concern is, though, is that basically you get into a position where Germany is going to do a lot of the spending on defense, going to do a lot of the spending on infrastructure, which is really in keeping with what Mario Draghi has been saying even before he was in this position, when he was at the ECB, saying that fiscal policy needs to start picking up its weight. But the problem is that it may not get to that European level, right? What Mario Draghi has been talking about is getting basically not national champions, getting European champions, doing M&A to get these companies in sort of a way to compete internationally, but also talking about obviously joint debt as a potential lever to pull in order to get new money into this defense industry. So listen, I think that in many ways the Donald Trump administration really has helped Mario Draghi getting his message across, but is it enough to basically go all the way of what Europe needs? That we'll still have to see.
And meanwhile, Ollie, the US saying that a truce, at least partial truce in the Black Sea has been agreed between Russia and Ukraine. What are the details of this agreement? To what extent does it actually move the needle?
Yeah, Tom, this is really interesting. When you actually start digging into what we got from each of the different parties, it sort of clouds the picture a little bit. Yes, you did at the sort of top line have an agreement to basically begin to have commercial shipping be sort of re-permitted across the Black Sea and basically have a ceasefire from any sort of targeting of those kinds of operations. The issue is you had basically 4 statements out from these 3 different parties, 2 from the White House, 1 from the Ukrainians, and 1 from the Kremlin. Basically, they all said that there had been some sort of deal sort of agreed to. However, when you look at the Kremlin statement, and this is very interesting, I'll quote sort of directly from there, that basically this ceasefire and this proposal is contingent on the following. It is contingent on the removal of sanctions imposed on financial institutions involved in ensuring international food trade, their reconnection, those financial institutions, to the SWIFT payment system, which we should say, Tom, is really at the heart of that sanctions regime that is against Russia right now. Also removal of sanctions on companies producing and exporting food, and also allowing basically the servicing of ships in ports and lifting the sanctions against ships flying the Russian flag that are involved in the food trade. Now, the U.S. administration statement didn't go that far. They said that, yes, they would help the Russians begin to get sort of re-access these markets, but they didn't go that far into going specifically into those details, which echoes sort of what we heard the last time around when basically the United States said that the Russians would agree to not strike energy and infrastructure. It was actually just energy infrastructure. So again, when we think about in the context of what Trump wants to achieve, how soon he wants to achieve it, there is still a major question of how much daylight there is between these two men, between Putin and Trump. And Trump even alluded to himself, alluded to it yesterday in an interview on Newsmax, saying that basically he sometimes has done this himself when he's trying to not sign a contract and kind of stall for time, and saying that maybe that's actually what Putin is up to now.
Bloomberg's Oliver Crook with the latest on that Black Sea deal and the questions that still remain. Ollie, thank you. Remaining on the defence space and with the lens on the UK, because the Chancellor here, Rachel Reeves, set to announce an extra £2.2 billion in defence spending over the next year in her spring statement later today. That's as the government aims, of course, to increase defence spending here to 2.5% of GDP in the near term. It comes amid a wider military spending and security push that Ollie's been talking about in Europe. We're joined exclusively now by Brad Greve, CFO of the London-based defence contractor BAE Systems, a crucial player, of course, within the global defence space. Brad, thank you for your time. £2.2 billion. How significant is that? How much of that flows to BAE? And how are you putting that to use?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Well, we are the largest defence contractor in the UK, so, we are ready to support the government and its spending plans. And, of course, the strategic defence review is something that we all look forward to seeing, and I think that will lay out a lot of those priorities that I think we are very well placed to support the government on.
On Europe, 150 billion euros in terms of the rearmament fund, but US and UK companies largely kept out of that until we sign a security pact with Brussels. Are you pressuring the government to do that? Do you expect that to happen? Do you expect the government to sign that pact so you can access that funding?
We already have pretty significant access to European markets anyway. So, today we have a £78 billion backlog that we announced at the end of last year when we talked about our results in February. And of that £78 billion backlog, almost a quarter of that is non-UK Europe. So we already have a very significant and material exposure to the Europe market. And that comes in things like MBDA, where we're 37.5% owner on. It comes through things like the Hägglunds and Bofors businesses that are made in Sweden. These are combat vehicles sold into Europe. And of course, F-35s that a lot of European nations are buying, and we have a work share on that program. So there's a lot of ways that we already participate in that European market. And I think the spending plans that are being announced, I think we will also see benefit from that.
How would you characterize this moment, Brad, in the defense space?
I think your earlier speaker had a good expression. I think it's a paradigm shift. I think things have fundamentally changed. You know, you look at since the end of the Cold War till today, there's about a 1.8 trillion underspend across Europe if you define 2% of GDP as the right level. So there's a catch-up that needs to be played, and there's also a rearming and a replenishment of the inventory that's gone into Ukraine. So we think that there's a very long-term super cycle that's going across European defense right now, and I think we're only just at the beginning of that.
And you talk about that 2% target, NATO setting its future target in June, 2%. Is it likely, should it be higher than that 2%? What are you expecting from that NATO decision?
Yeah, we'll have to see. That's a pretty important milestone. We do expect to see a pretty significant increase above that 2%. I don't know what that's going to be, but you know, if it's, let's say, 3%, you know, we're talking about 100 to 200 billion more in annual spending across Europe to get there. So it is, again, support for this super cycle that we see. Should you as CFO put the primacy right now on investment versus returning cash to shareholders, given the defence needs? Well, we are doing both. I mean, we spent close to £1 billion in CapEx last year, which is a record for us, and you know that number will be similar again in 2025. So about £1 billion in 2025. Exactly. Which areas? Where will that CapEx be focused? Yeah, we're spending on to drive the growth that we have in the backlog, and beyond that £78 billion backlog, there's about £180 billion where we're the incumbent on positions that will eventually turn into backlog. So the pipeline is more than 9 times our current revenue today. And so we are building CapEx to drive that growth, but we're also increasing investments to drive the efficiency of how we deliver. And what we're trying to do is optimize defense capability per pound or dollar spent by our government customers. And so investing in CapEx to improve efficiency is part of that. Given that backlog then, and the huge demand that's coming through, does that $1 billion in terms of CapEx spend seem a little under ambitious? I mean, you need to be doing a lot more. Can you deliver on the demand that's coming through? Is the spending, the investment that you're pledging going to be enough to deliver on the orders that you expect? Yeah, we're spending at record levels already. We need to see the government spending plans, and they are plans right now, convert to actually orders. And once those orders come in, we're ready to build capacity to deliver those. But if you look at our combat vehicles business, we delivered over 600 vehicles in 2024. And that's going to be significantly increasing in 2025 with our existing investments that we've made. So we're already building for growth, and we're already delivering more capacity. With our munitions business in the UK, we've increased investments to deliver an 8 times increase in capacity in the UK. Yeah. So we're already making those investments. But it sounds like once you get clarity from the government plans, you could step up that Indeed, CapEx. That's exactly right. And you'd be ready to do that this year if you get that clarity? We are absolutely ready to support our governments. You've been on a road trip, and you've been speaking to investors all over the world. How has the sentiment amongst investors changed? Yeah, there's, I think, a recognition of that paradigm shift. There's sort of 2 macro tailwinds that are affecting the industry right now. One is obviously the clear need for Europe to become more independent on its defense and to bolster its capabilities. We can see that every day, everywhere, in what we read and what we see and what we hear from our governments. And so that European drive is very clear. And then the other one is the U.S.'s focus on Indo-Pacific. And that brings its own set of capabilities that are far different to a European theater. And then if you look at our U.S. portfolio, our strategy has been to get closer alignment with the national defense strategy of the U.S. And that's why the acquisition of Ball Aerospace is an important part of that, where space becomes a very important part of the Indo-Pacific theater, as does electronic warfare. And so those are the 2 areas that we've been really investing a lot in the last several years, and that plays well into Indo-Pacific. Are you going to step up investments as you look at those new technologies, whether it's drones or satellites or artificial intelligence? Are you ready to pull the trigger on more investments in that space this year? Yeah, absolutely, and that's exactly what we've been doing. And if you go back to the U.S., you know, one of the key areas of focus for the U.S. strategy is about protecting the homeland. And you've read things about the Golden Dome, which is sort of the Iron Dome equivalent in the U.S., and that takes a lot of what we have in terms of capability, especially in space. So those investments, that we've made recently, I think will play well into how this administration is looking at its defense requirements. How much are you setting aside for acquisitions this year? We have plenty of capacity. We have a very complete portfolio today. So every warfighting domain we have very good coverage in. So there's no glaring missing parts of the portfolio. So we'll continue to look at bolt-on acquisitions, things that are technology infills. We've made quite a few of those in 2024. So we acquired a lot of drone capability. We also acquired counter-drone capability. And as we've seen in Ukraine, this goes from strength to strength in terms of its importance.
There's some suggestions that the Italian manufacturer Iveco, that you could be looking at their defence unit. Can you confirm that that would be of interest? That is of interest? Have you had any talks with Iveco?
Yeah, I wouldn't comment on anything like that. I mean, clearly we have a very strong combat vehicles business. And, you know, if you look at what we do in the U.S., we have a fantastic portfolio there. And in Europe, I mentioned Hägglunds and Bofors. So, you know, what we have today is pretty complete.
You have a joint venture with Leonardo and with the Japanese manufacturer as well, JAEC, around a future fighter jet. Can you give us an update on the program and how far that's kind of evolving, how much progress you've made on that front, and what costs are looking like?
Yeah, Tom. So the GCAP program is one of these once-in-a-generation programs. So it's a 6th-gen fighter capability that, as you say, is in combination with industrial partners in Japan and Italy. And we're making really good progress. I mean, ultimately in the UK, we think that can support up to 16,000 jobs. So the joint venture has been announced, pending regulatory clearances. We hope to have announcements on that final legal structure, sometime in the coming months. So we're excited by the progress, and we should have a flying demonstrator up in the air in the next 3 years.
Are you comfortable with costs? What are the projected costs at this point?
Well, I mean, we are supported by the funding that we have in place, and that program is going to be a long-term program.
And did the Saudis become a partner in that program?
That's for the government to decide. Those are the governments of the consortium need to figure out what partners they want in. But there's certainly room to add capabilities and partners, but that's really for the governments to decide.
Back to the investment shift that you're seeing and your conversations with investors. Obviously, for a long time, the defence space has been shunned by parts of this investment community, pension funds, ESG funds. That is starting to change now. Does BAE deserve to be in an ESG fund?
Well, we think that security is fundamental to a free society, and I think our government's primary role is to protect its citizens, and so we firmly believe that defense contractors play an important role in protecting the system of the West that we hold dear. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that BAE Systems fits well into that context.
On the credit rating, you're at BBB. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit. You're the CFO. You've got a BBB rating for most of the agencies. Given the backlog, given the demand, given the impulse around the spend around defence, do you deserve to have a credit upgrade? Does it give you enough room to manoeuvre?
We've got a very strong balance sheet. The ratings for the Moody's, SPs, and Fitches to decide, so I'll let them do their work. But we have a very strong balance sheet, and a balance sheet that gives us the capacity to do what we need to do, which is grow our business. And we've been allocating capital in ways that really have been value creating for our shareholders and helpful for our customers as we talked about, as we increase investments for them.
You talked about space earlier in the conversation. Is Europe vulnerable given its reliance on Starlink, and can that capacity be filled by European or UK manufacturers?
It can be, and there is a gap today, and I think that dependency is pretty strong today. So I think that is one area that Europe and the UK will need to focus on as it tries to create more independence. That is a key capability that is underinvested in because of that reliance on the US.
And the time frame for filling a gap around Starlink and around that capability?
Yeah, I won't put a timeline on it, but this is years, not months.
Okay. And you are confident overall in terms of the pipeline you can deliver. I think that's a key question, isn't it, for governments and for your clients before we let you go, that you can deliver on this huge pipeline and the orders. You're confident you have the capex spending and the build out to be able to deliver on these orders in the time frame that's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. We've grown our headcount by 15,000 people in the last 2 years. So we've been ramping up considerably. And we've been increasing capex, as we said, and there's more room to go on that, and there's more growth to go. With our guidance that we've given in 2025, we're looking at a 10% compound annual growth rate over the last 3 years on the top line, and we think with the backlog and pipeline, we're set for continued growth.
OK, Brad, thank you very much indeed for taking the time. Brad Greve, of course, BAE Systems CFO, and that exclusive conversation focused, of course, on the all-important defence space. Coming up to the metal space and what's happening on the tariff front, copper trading in New York hits a record. Bloomberg understands US tariffs on the metal could be coming within weeks. We're going to bring you the details. This is Bloomberg. This is The Pulse. You're looking live at the Principal Room. Coming up later today, do not miss our interview with the Signet Chairman and CEO, David Cordani. That's around 12:30 p.m. New York time, 4:30 London time. This is Bloomberg.
The soft data would tell you that the U.S. consumer is being a bit more cautious. They don't have quite as much confidence. The hard data is not in yet. The hard data will be in a few months. But I would say it's interesting to see how, raising rates almost 400 basis points the last couple of years didn't create a slowdown of financial conditions. But this administration, quickly because of headlines, has created a bit of concerns.
The president of Apollo Global Management, Jim Zelter, on the uncertainty coming from the White House. And staying with the Trump administration, let's turn to our scoop this morning. Bloomberg understands US tariffs on copper imports could come within several weeks. That would be months earlier than the deadline for a decision. Copper trading in New York rising to a record. Let's bring in Bloomberg's senior executive editor for energy and commodities, Will Kennedy. Will, congratulations to you and the team on the scoop. How big a deal is this then for the copper markets? There had been a timeline put in place by the Trump administration. It seems like that's being pulled forward.
That's our understanding based on our reporting last night. When they'd done similar investigations in the first Trump term, it had taken 10 months to reach these decisions. But what Joe and the rest of the team discovered last night is that there's a lot of appetite within the Trump administration to impose these tariffs in copper within weeks. Now, what's been happening is that traders have been moving many, many tons of copper from the London market to the New York market. As you reported there, that spread has really blown up to more than $1,700 a ton, so sort of more than 10% of the price. It's a real market dislocation, and a lot of metal is on the water travelling into the US. The risk now for many traders is, A, these tariffs don't come in at the level all the time predicted, and B, if they do, will they get their metal into the US in time? So it's really adding to the sense of market dislocation and the volatility that the whole tariffs and the slightly chaotic way in which they're introduced is adding to volatility in metals markets.
Yeah, that dislocation is unprecedented, isn't it? So we have this race on the high seas to get copper into the US market. Talking the high seas, the deal between Russia and Ukraine, as the US describes it, in the Black Sea. Talk to us about the impact that that's having on the soft commodity space and oil.
Well, the Black Sea has obviously been a zone of conflict, and it has had an impact on shipping markets. Earlier in the war, there was this deal to get grain out of Ukraine. In truth, goods have been flowing across the Black Sea. We are seeing grain exports from Ukraine. We are seeing grain exports from Russia, the world's biggest wheat exporter. So the impact won't be huge, and it's important to say that it doesn't seem this has actually been agreed, that Russia seems to be demanding quite a lot before this actually happens. But as tensions lessen, what it will do is reduce shipping costs down the line potentially. Clearly, stuff is flowing outside the Black Sea, but it's expensive to hire ships who are willing to go to the Black Sea. It's expensive to insure them. If we do get a de-escalation, those costs will reduce and ultimately feed through into the prices that are paid on global markets.
Will, thank you very much indeed. On the Black Sea, the impacts on soft commodities, oil, and of course the Bloomberg scoop around copper and that dislocation on prices with potential tariffs coming through quicker than some had expected. Our executive editor, of course, Will Kennedy. Now, to the bonus story and another certainly for our audience, a key story when it comes to what is happening on the financial front. Average Wall Street bonuses surging last year, with a total pool for payouts jumping to a record $47.5 billion as industry profits soared. The average annual bonus rising by almost a third to $244 $1,700, just to be precise, in the first significant increase since the COVID pandemic. That is according to estimates by the New York State Controller. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Jenny Serene. Jenny, champagne corks popping then on Wall Street. What's behind this?
Yes, I mean, I think certainly about a month ago they were. So it's important to remember that this is all backwards-looking data. So this is for the 2024 year, and it's really important actually to remember kind of where we ended the year, because that's when a lot of these decisions were being made by the big banks. So at the end of the year, you had Trump coming in. There was a lot of excitement about what he might mean for capital markets activity, for deal-making activity. Everyone kind of thought that those were all up arrow. We had already started to see sort of a flurry of activity around the different markets. And so that was sort of the mindset that they were in at the end of last year when they were setting these bonus pools and handing out these bonuses in recent months to these traders and bankers. What I think, will be interesting from here is how, now that Trump has actually come in and we haven't quite seen a lot of that activity materialize, whether or not that excitement and exuberance remains.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up question, Jenny. I mean, what is your expectation? What are banking executives kind of hinting at? It's early days. We're only in March. But does this trend, I mean, if the deal-making picks up, if rates remain kind of on a downward trajectory, can we expect that maybe the activity around bonuses, that we could kind of maintain at these levels or maybe even edge a little higher? These are record levels, after all.
Yes. No, I mean, Wall Street famously is an eat-what-you-kill business. So if things turn around and if things pick up the way that we came into the year thinking that they would, then certainly I think there's always room for these payouts to grow. And banks have shown, no sign that they would be ever unwilling to not, pay folks for good performance. But if things keep trending the way that they have been, where the economic uncertainty, the potential tariff or trade war, and all of this, kind of general geopolitical uncertainty that still is prevailing, if that keeps weighing on corporate sentiment, if we don't see deals get done, if we even start to see it, cause a damper on trading volatility, then I think, it will be a very different picture this time next year, which, for the comptroller, of course, who's really focused on that tax revenue that comes out of these bonuses, it would be, obviously a bad sign for the New York budget in a way.
Jenny, what is the biggest catalyst for these banks right now? Is it the rate trajectory of the Federal Reserve, or is it expectations of a slightly slower paced U.S. economy in terms of the growth picture?
I mean, I think on the deal-making and trading side, which is where you're kind of looking at these bonuses, it's a lot of it is just sentiment. And so it's obviously the rates picture and how the Fed comes in here and how they react. But I think it's also just the idea that do corporates know that the environment that they are going to be doing a deal in will be the same environment that, they're living in a year from now. And for as long as that uncertainty persists, that will be a natural damper on any type of deal-making or capital markets activity. You just see a lot of folks saying, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what the environment's going to be. I'm going to sit this one out and be on the sidelines. And so bankers hate that. Obviously they want a raring and ready to go capital markets. So I think that sentiment piece is really crucial in their minds to kind of turn this around. Yeah, the gravitational pull of that uncertainty that, of course, continues. Exactly. Bloomberg's Jenny Serene, thank you very much indeed on the bonus story, a record coming through for Wall Street. Don't forget our special coverage, of course, of the Chancellor's spring statement. That's at 12:30 p.m. London time. Let's check in on the UK markets right now. A bit of good news for the Chancellor leading up to this spring statement, with inflation on the headline coming through softer than expected. You've seen a bid for gilts, the pound a little softer, the FTSE 100 currently flat, also looking for direction. It's up about 6% year to date. The pound is at 129, down 0.3%, a little softer then, and the bids for UK government debt yields down 5 basis points on the front end, 2-year at 4.24. Up next, Bloomberg surveillance.